The first voice came through at 3:47 Galactic Standard, a Veshtari trade dispatcher screaming coordinates into a channel nobody was supposed to be monitoring. 3 seconds later, a second voice trampled it, a convoy escort officer from the Drenali Freight Combine, his words shredded by static, reporting his formation scattered and burning across the Yoth reach. Then a third voice, female, calm in the way that only training can produce, identifying herself as the weapons officer of a Trekkie border cutter and requesting immediate coalition assistance. Then a fourth, barely intelligible. Then a fifth. Within 90 seconds, the emergency band was a wall of overlapping distress calls, 7 distinct sources broadcasting from the same narrow corridor of stable space, all saying the same thing in different languages. "We are under attack. We cannot run. Someone please answer." Commander Marin Calloway was already pulling her boots on when the alert hit the crew quarters. She crossed the corridor at a dead sprint, took the ladder to the operations deck of the UENS Resolve 2 rungs at a time, and hit the hatch with her shoulder hard enough to make the Marine on watch step aside without being asked. The compartment was lit red, every console alive, data streaming across 6 screens. Her comms officer, Petty Officer D. Howe, turned in his chair with a face she had seen exactly twice before in 14 years of Terran Navy service, both times preceding the worst days of her life. "Multiple distress calls, Commander. 7 distinct sources in the Yoth reach. I'm reading 2 civilian grain haulers, a 3-ship freight convoy, a Trekkie border patrol vessel, and a colony transport. They're all reporting the same thing. An unidentified raider flotilla came out of the drift and hit them in the shipping corridor." Calloway reached the central display. The holographic plot showed the Yoth reach, a thin corridor of stable gravity between 2 dead space regions. 14 icons blinked inside it, 7 broadcasting distress. 7 hostile contacts, moving in a slow contracting spiral like a net tightening around trapped fish. "How far?" she asked. 4 hours at flank speed." "Who else is in range?" D. Howe checked. His fingers moved across the console, querying coalition fleet positions, Drenali patrol schedules, Trekkie naval deployments, independent security contractors, everything. He checked again, widening the search radius. Then he looked at her, and his expression was the answer before he spoke. "Nobody, Commander. The coalition patrol withdrew to the Setha border 3 days ago for fleet exercises. The nearest Drenali response squadron is 11 hours out and hasn't acknowledged the emergency signal. Trekkie Naval Command received the hail, but their internal channels suggest a political dispute over jurisdictional authority in the Reach. They're arguing about whose responsibility it is." "A political dispute?" "Yes, Commander." "While their own cutter is being shot at?" "Yes, Commander." Calloway stared at the plot. 7 ships in distress. Some were carrying grain, some were carrying manufactured goods, and at least one, the colony transport, the largest icon, the one broadcasting the loudest distress signal, was carrying people. The nearest friendly response apart from her single frigate, a ship with 60 crew, moderate armament, and exactly 0 reinforcements, was half a day away. "Get me the captain." Captain Elias Rourke was on the operations deck within 4 minutes, uniform hastily fastened, one boot laced improperly. He listened to D. Howe's summary with his arms folded across his chest, studying the holographic plot with the expression of a man doing arithmetic he already knew the answer to. He needed exactly 30 seconds before he gave the order Calloway knew was coming. "All ahead flank, set condition 1 throughout the ship. Commander Calloway, you have rescue coordination." The Resolve leaped forward. 240 meters of Terran alloy, 1 frigate-class reactor, and a crew of 60 who had enlisted because they believed the words etched into the ship's commissioning plaque meant something real. Calloway did not dwell on the numbers stacked against them. She had a job, and the job started with building a picture of what they were running toward. The Yoth Reach was a graveyard in progress. The Raider flotilla 8 ships, light and fast, armed with short-range beam cutters and missile racks, purpose-built for corridor ambush work, had hit the shipping lane at its narrowest point and fanned out to trap everything inside. The first casualties were the 2 Veshtari grain haulers, engines dead, drifting with hull breaches venting golden cargo dust into the void like blood from a wound. A Drenali freight convoy of 3 ships had scattered at the first volley. One was destroyed outright, ripped in half by concentrated fire. The second was hemorrhaging atmosphere from its cargo bays. The third had gone dark and was either playing dead or already gone. The Threki border cutter, the Shethvarak, was still fighting, its weapons officer's voice clipped and professional on the open channel. But it was outgunned 4-1, and Calloway could hear, behind the tactical jargon, the sound of a ship taking hits it could not sustain. And at the center of the corridor, drifting at a crawl because its primary engines had been hit in the opening salvo, was a Veshtari colony transport. 1,100 passengers, civilians. Workers being relocated to frontier settlements on the far side of the Reach. Families. The transport's name was the Kethara. Its captain was a Veshtari named Shelvorath, and Calloway heard his voice for the first time at 412. A clicking, harmonic sound that the translator rendered as an old male, deeply calm under tremendous strain, reporting his situation with the precision of someone who had been in trouble before and survived it by being exact. To any vessel receiving, this is Colony Transport Kethara, Veshtari Registry. We have sustained engine damage and cannot maneuver. Shields are holding at 31%. We have 1,114 souls aboard, including 406 juveniles. We are requesting immediate escort or extraction. Our position is Beacon 7 of the Yoth Reach corridor. Raiders are closing from bearing. A burst of static tore through his transmission, weapons fire impacting his hull. Then his voice returned, thinner, the lower harmonics stripped away by damage to his comms array. Bearing 047. We can hold position, but we cannot run. If anyone is listening, we need help. Calloway keyed the reply channel. She kept her voice level, professional, the way she had been trained, the way the service demanded, because the man on the other end of this channel needed to hear competence, not sympathy. Kethara, this is UENS Resolve, Terran Navy frigate. We are inbound to your position. Estimated arrival 3 hours 42 minutes. Hold your position, conserve shield power, consolidate your passengers to interior compartments away from the outer hull. We are coming. A long pause, long enough for Calloway to hear the subharmonic vibrations in the background of Voreth's transmission, the low, pervasive hum of over 1,000 Veshtari aboard his ship, communicating at frequencies below human hearing. It traveled through the signal like a living undertone, and it meant something she could not yet translate. Resolve, say again your classification. Terran Navy frigate, 1 ship. Terran vessel, you are aware we are facing 8 hostile ships. Affirmative. And you are 1 vessel. Also affirmative. Start moving your passengers, Captain. We'll sort out the arithmetic when we get there. She closed the channel before he could argue and turned to D-Howe. Open a broadband channel, all frequencies, maximum power. I want every ship in that corridor, every raider, every survivor, and every eavesdropping station within 50 light minutes to hear this. He set it up. She keyed the mic. All vessels in the Yoth Reach corridor, this is Commander Marin Calloway, UENS Resolve. A Terran Navy rescue force is inbound to your position at best speed. Any vessel capable of maneuvering, rally on the Kethara colony transport at Beacon 7. Any vessel with weapons capability, engage targets of opportunity to slow the raider advance. Any vessel too damaged to move, broadcast your position on this channel and prepare for extraction. Resolve out. It was not a lie. It was not exactly the truth, either. She had called herself a rescue force. She was one frigate with 60 people and a pair of shuttles. But the language mattered to the survivors who needed to hear that someone was coming, and to the raiders who needed to wonder exactly how many ships that someone represented. The effect was immediate and measurable. The Threki cutter Sheth Varek altered course toward the Kethara, its captain reading the tactical situation and choosing consolidation over isolated combat. The surviving Drenali freighter, the one hemorrhaging atmosphere, powered its battered engines and began limping toward the same rally point. And the raider flotilla, reading the Terran military identification code in the resolve signal header, paused. They paused for 11 minutes while their commanders tried to determine how large the incoming Terran force actually was. Then they resumed their advance. But 11 minutes mattered. 11 minutes let the Sheth Varek reach the Kethara and take a defensive position. 11 minutes let the Drenali freighter limp close enough to shelter in the colony transport's sensor shadow. 11 minutes let the Kethara's crew seal 3 additional hull breaches. 11 minutes turned a spread of isolated, dying ships into a cluster outgunned, barely shielded but together. Calloway spent the transit building her rescue plan. 2 shuttles, 18 damage control specialists, 4 trauma pods, and 1 field surgeon chief petty officer Ewan, who had treated blast injuries on 7 worlds and never lost a patient she could physically reach. Against 1,100 civilians and 8 raiders, she had a fraction of what the situation demanded. She worked the problem anyway because the alternative was unacceptable. D-Hal, pull everything on the Kethara's layout. Deck plans, bulkhead ratings, emergency systems, hull composition, atmosphere specifications. And get me the complete Veshtari physiology file from the medical database. Ewan needs to know what she's operating on before we arrive. Already pulling it, Commander. Forwarding to medical now. The Veshtari were insected hard-shelled, compound-eyed, 6-limbed, with laminated chitin exoskeletons segmented at the joints. Their young were smaller, softer, chitin not yet hardened, still translucent where copper-based hemolymph pulsed beneath the surface. They breathed nitrogen-heavy atmosphere that burned human throats after extended exposure. Their blood coagulated slowly under stress and dried in shades of dark green. They communicated through mandible clicks and subharmonic vibrations that resonated through their thoraxes. A Veshtari crowd did not shout, it hummed, and the hum carried through solid structures, audible as vibration in the bones of anyone standing near. Their culture was labor caste, communal. Children were raised collectively, protected by the community as a shared obligation. Calloway memorized the essentials and forwarded the file to Ewan with an annotation. Copper blood, slow clotting, chitin fractures instead of bone breaks, juveniles are soft-shelled and need warmth. Prepare for all of it. At 5:31, 90 minutes into the transit, Calloway called a briefing in the ready room. Her damage control teams, her shuttle pilots, Ewan, and the department heads. She laid out the situation with the flat, factual delivery that her people had come to expect from her, because dressing up bad odds in optimism was something she considered a form of lying to people who deserved better. We're going into a corridor with 8 raider ships and 7 distress vessels, at least 2 of which are already dead. Our primary objective is the Kethara colony transport, 1,100 civilians, including 400 children. Secondary objective is recovery of any survivors from the other vessels. We have no reinforcements inside of 6 hours. We are it. She paused. The room was quiet. The raiders are not a military force. They're corridor pirates armed for merchant shipping, not warship engagement. Captain Rourke can handle them. Our job is not the fight. Our job is the rescue, getting aboard the Kethara, stabilizing its structure, treating its wounded, and if necessary, evacuating its passengers to this ship. Questions? Chief Torres, her senior damage control specialist, A stocky man with scarred hands and a voice like gravel raised one. "Commander, the Cathara is Veshtari composite construction. Our patch kits are rated for Terran spec alloys. Different thermal expansion, different bonding characteristics. Standard patches will hold for minutes, not hours." "I know. That's why we're going to improvise. I want your team ready to cut structural braces from the Cathara's own framing and weld them into place using our rigs. It won't be pretty. It needs to hold." Tors nodded. He was already thinking through it. Ewan spoke next. "Medical readiness for multi-species casualty care is limited. I've reviewed the Veshtari file. I can stabilize chitin fractures and manage copper-based hemorrhaging with chemical agents if I can synthesize them from the Cathara's own pharmaceutical stores. But I'll need access to their medical supplies within the first hour aboard." "You'll have it." Shuttle pilot Lieutenant Vasquez. "Ma'am, if we're doing shuttle transfers under fire, I need to know the docking configuration on the Cathara. Their airlocks may not be compatible with our collar." "D-Hal is pulling the specs now. If the collar doesn't fit, you hard dock and we cut our way in. Anything else?" Silence. Calloway looked at each of them. "We are going to lose people in that corridor today. Some of them are already gone. The ones who are still alive are waiting for us. Move." At 5:47, 2 hours into the transit, D-Hal intercepted a fragment of Veshtari communication from the Cathara, not a distress call, but an internal broadcast. Voreth's voice, speaking to his own people, carried on a frequency that leaked past the colony transport's damaged antenna array. The translator caught it imperfectly, but the content was clear enough. Voreth was telling his 1,100 passengers that help was not coming, that the coalition had not responded, that the Drenali fleet was too far, that no one was answering. He did not mention the resolve. Either the colony transport's sensors were too damaged to detect the frigate's approach signature, or Voreth did not believe a single Terran warship constituted help. Calloway could not blame him for either possibility. She keyed the channel. "Cathara, resolve. Be advised we are 2 hours and 14 minutes from your position, maintaining flank speed. We are coming. Acknowledge." A pause. Then Voreth's voice, and this time Calloway heard what the translator could not fully convey, the sound of a man who had told his people there was no hope and was now being asked to unsay it. "Acknowledged, resolve. 2 hours 14 minutes. Tell your people, Captain." Another pause. Then the subharmonic shift, Voreth speaking to the Cathara's population on their internal frequency. Calloway could not hear the words, but she felt the vibration change in the carrier signal, and she imagined she could feel it in the deck beneath her feet. The hum of 1,000 beings learning that someone was, against all reason, on the way. At 6:03, the Cathara's sensor array transmitted a data packet: damage assessment, passenger manifest, structural integrity map. Calloway read the manifest first. 406 juveniles, each annotated with their parent's name and their assigned emergency muster station. Someone on the Cathara had taken the time, while the ship was being shot at, to ensure that every child could be matched to an adult. That told Calloway everything she needed to know about Captain Voreth. She forwarded the manifest to Ewan and the shuttle teams. Then she began memorizing the Cathara's maintenance access corridors, the secondary routes, the utility passages, the shortcuts that did not appear on the standard deck plans. Some part of her already knew she would need them. At 6:14, 2 hours and 27 minutes into the transit, the situation in the Yoth reach deteriorated sharply. The raiders split into 2 groups. 4 continued pressing the Cathara cluster, probing its defenses, testing the Sheth Varak's fire arcs. The other 4 broke off and began systematically running down the disabled vessels scattered across the corridor, the 2 Veshtari grain haulers, the dark Drenali freighter. Calloway heard the grain haulers die. Their distress calls went from desperate to frantic to a single shrieking carrier tone that cut off mid-syllable. The raiders were not taking prisoners. They were stripping the hulls for cargo and leaving the crews to vacuum. 14 Veshtari sailors on the first hauler, 9 on the second, dead in the time it took Calloway to cross the operations deck. She gripped the edge of the console until her knuckles went white, held for 3 breaths, then forced her hands open. Grief later. The living needed her now, and every second spent on the dead was a second stolen from the 1100 aboard the Cathara. At 6:38, the surviving Drenali freighter lost its remaining engine. Its captain, a merchant named Thas, whose voice was reedy and stubborn, reported 0 propulsion, 0 weapons, 43 crew. Calloway told him to dock against the Cathara's starboard hull and transfer his people aboard. He argued about abandoning his cargo. She told him again, harder. He docked. At 6:49, the Sheth Varak took a direct hit to its reactor housing. Its captain, a Trekkie naval officer whose clipped professionalism Calloway had come to rely on over the previous 2 hours, reported coolant loss, failing containment, and ordered his 43 crew to evacuate to the Cathara. The Veshtari workers aboard the colony transport cracked open cargo bay doors without being asked, reaching out with 6-armed efficiency to haul the Trekkie sailors inside in their emergency suits, one after another, asking no questions. The Sheth Varak went dark, drifting beside the Cathara like a spent shell, its hull still radiating heat. The Cathara was alone now. 1 colony transport with failing shields, 1,100 Veshtari civilians, 400 of them children, 43 Trekkie sailors, 43 Drenali crew, and 4 raiders circling it in a patient orbit, firing occasional ranging shots to bleed the shields. At 7:02, the UENS Resolve dropped out of superluminal transit and entered the Yoth Reach at full combat speed. Calloway saw the corridor through the forward display and felt her stomach constrict. Wreckage everywhere. The grain haulers were gutted shells tumbling in slow rotation, golden cargo dust dispersing in expanding clouds. The Drenali convoy was a field of fragmented hull plating and frozen atmosphere crystals glinting in the distant starlight. The Sheth Varak drifted nose down, venting coolant into a milky plume. And at the center of it all, the Cathara sat motionless, running lights burning, hull cratered and scarred, 4 raiders circling it in a formation that had already selected the spots where the next shots would land. "All hands battle stations," Rourke said from his chair, his voice carrying across the deck like a physical thing. "Commander Calloway, you have the rescue. I have the fight." The Resolve hit the raider formation at full speed. A Terran frigate was not a capital ship, but it was crewed by 60 people who had spent 4 hours listening to civilians die and were finished listening. Rourke drove straight through the formation. The railgun spoke first, a 3-round salvo through the lead raider's engine block, each tungsten penetrator punching clean through and exiting in a spray of molten alloy. The raider folded like a crushed can. Dead ship. Then a broadside of missiles, scattering the remaining 3. The raiders pulled back to regroup outside weapons range. Rourke did not pursue. He brought the Resolve alongside the Cathara, matching its drift, presenting his shielded port flank to the raider formation. Calloway was already moving. Shuttle 1 launch, Shuttle 2 launch. Damage control teams to the docking collar. Medical section prepare to receive multi-species casualties. Vasquez, you have shuttle coordination. Move. She was running for the shuttle bay before her last word finished echoing. The Cathara up close was worse than the sensors had promised. Its hull was cratered with overlapping impacts. The Veshtari composite buckled and cracked in branching patterns. One entire section of the port side had been peeled open, sealed only by emergency bulkheads never designed for sustained combat. Through the gaps, interior lighting flickered amber, the color of a ship that knew it was dying. She boarded Shuttle 1 with 6 damage control specialists. The docking collar sealed against the Cathara's emergency airlock with a grinding thud, and she stepped aboard. The smell hit first copper and ozone. The scent of Veshtari atmosphere mixed with overloaded electrical systems and something else. The pheromonal signature of collective fear, a chemical undercurrent that clung to everything. The lighting was amber and low. The corridors were built for beings shorter and wider than humans, forcing Calloway to duck constantly, and the Veshtari were everywhere. They lined the corridors, adults pressed flat against the walls, children clustered between their legs, compound eyes catching the emergency lighting in fractured amber reflections. They were silent in a way Calloway had never experienced from a crowd of over 1,000. No weeping. No shouting. No visible panic. Just the deep subharmonic hum of vibration she felt in her teeth, in her sternum, in the bones of her skull, 1,000 bodies communicating at frequencies below human hearing, filling the ship like a pulse. Captain Voreth met her at the junction of the main corridor. He was old for a Veshtari, chitin faded to dull amber, movements deliberate and measured, 2 of his 6 limbs hanging motionless at his sides where shrapnel had damaged them. His compound eyes held her reflection in 100 fractured images. "Commander Calloway," he said through the translator, mandibles clicking, "you came. I told you I would. Show me you're wounded." He led her to Deck 3. The forward compartment had been converted to a casualty station, and it was bad. 47 Veshtari with injuries ranging from hairline chitin fractures to deep concussive tissue damage, where the internal organs had been bruised through the shell. Their copper blood had dried in dark green streaks on the deck and walls, and the air was thick with the smell of it. 9 were critical cracked thoraxes, hemorrhaging hemolymph through fracture lines that were not closing because Veshtari blood clotted slowly under stress. Ewan arrived with the second shuttle load and took command of the medical situation without a word. She had synthesized treatment protocols during the transit. Within 15 minutes, she was elbow-deep in alien physiology, stabilizing fracture lines with surgical adhesive, managing copper-based coagulation with chemical agents improvised from the Cathara's pharmaceutical stores, monitoring hemolymph oxygen through translucent joint tissue. "Commander," Ewan said as Calloway passed through, "if you can get me access to their pharmaceutical locker on Deck 2, I can synthesize a coagulant analog that will work with their blood chemistry. Without it, the critical cases will bleed out within hours." "You'll have access, I'll make sure of it." Calloway moved on. The Cathara was a ship full of problems and she had to prioritize. Wounded were being treated. The next crisis was structural. "The juveniles," Voreth said, leading her toward the lower decks. His voice caught a clicking stutter that the translator rendered as a slight break, but which she recognized from the file as the Veshtari equivalent of a throat closing with emotion. "Deck 4. We moved them to the most interior section when the first attack hit, but the bulkheads there are beginning to fail. The impact on frame 31 shifted the entire lateral bracing structure." Calloway checked her suit's structural readout. The Cathara's overall integrity was at 41% and dropping at a rate of roughly 1% every 12 minutes. The bulkheads on Deck 4 were rated for emergency containment, not sustained combat stress. At this rate, they had maybe 4 hours before a structural cascade would breach the interior sections. Less, if the raiders hit the ship again. She followed Voreth down. The corridors narrowed. The amber light dimmed. And then she stepped through the hatch into the juvenile compartment, and the size of what she had signed up for hit her in the chest. 400 Veshtari children packed into a space designed for 100. They sat on the cold deck in tight clusters, their soft chitin pale, unhardened, still translucent at the joints where the amber light showed the faint pulse of copper-based hemolymph beneath the surface, catching the emergency lighting in delicate patterns. Among them, arranged in a deliberate ring facing outward toward the doors, were the workers. Labor-caste Veshtari with scarred, darkened shells and powerful forelimbs built for construction and heavy lifting. They had positioned themselves as a living wall between the children and whatever might come through those hatches. Not armed, not trained for combat, not soldiers, but there with their bodies because that was what they had. One of the children looked up at Calloway. Its compound eyes were wider than an adult's, not yet fully segmented, and they caught the light of her suit's shoulder lamp and scattered it into a cascade of amber gold reflections. It made a sound, a high, thin click that the translator rendered as a question. "What is she?" Calloway knelt on the cold deck. "I'm here to help." "We're going to get you out." The child's mandibles moved, but it said nothing more. It reached out one thin, unhardened forelimb and touched Calloway's gloved hand, so lightly she almost did not feel it. She stood and keyed her comms. "Resolve, Calloway. I need structural reinforcement kits, everything we have. Emergency atmosphere packs rated for nitrogen-heavy mix. Send Tors with the heavy welding rig and send Akafer with the secondary patch kit. The juvenile compartment on Deck 4 is the critical priority." "Copy, Commander. Loading Shuttle 2 now." "Captain Vorath, status on your shields." "The shield generator failed 11 minutes ago." The words hit like a physical blow. No shields, bare hull against Raider beam weapons. Every second they sat here was a second. The Cathara's skin was the only thing between 1,100 people and vacuum. "Resolve, Calloway. Cathara has 0 shield capability. Repeat, 0 shields. Request Captain Rourke reposition to provide direct hull-to-hull coverage. This ship cannot take another hit without losing occupied compartments." "Copy, Commander. Captain Rourke is moving now." Through the Cathara's hull, she felt the vibration change, the thrum of the Resolve's engines as the frigate maneuvered outside, placing its own hull and its own shield envelope between the colony transport and the raiders. One frigate using itself as a physical shield for 1,100 civilians. The geometry was insane. It was also the only geometry available. At 7:14, while waiting for Tors, Calloway assessed the Cathara's remaining systems. Life support on backup generators deteriorating. Atmospheric recyclers overloaded. Water reclamation failed entirely, 18 hours of stored reserves. The math was marginally better than the tactical situation, but not by enough to provide comfort. She found the Trekkie sailors quartered in a cargo bay on Deck 2. Their senior officer, a compact, silver-furred Trekkie lieutenant named Vossren, met her at the hatch. The Trekkie were mammalian, fur-coated, with sharp-featured faces and cat-reflective eyes. They looked exhausted and angry, but Vossren was professional. "Commander," she said, her translator giving her voice a flat, precise quality, "my sailors are combat-trained. We have no weapons, but we have hands and we know damage control. Put us to work." Calloway did not hesitate. "Deck 3, frame 20 through 35. The lateral bracing is compromised. I need your people reinforcing the internal structure. Use anything available, strip non-essential bulkheads if you have to. Buy us time." Vossren nodded and her sailors moved. Within 10 minutes, 43 Trekkie were working alongside Veshtari laborers, stripping non-essential paneling from the Cathara's interior walls and bracing it against the weakened lateral frames. They did not speak each other's language. They did not need to. The work was the language and both species understood it. The Drenali crew, under their stubborn Captain Thas, had taken over the water reclamation system. Thas was an engineer by culture and temperament. He took one look at the failed recycler, cursed in 3 languages, and started pulling it apart. By 7:20, he had it partially functional, buying the Cathara 6 additional hours of water. Tors arrived with the heavy welding rig, and they went to work. The reinforcement kits were Terran alloy on Veshtari composite, different thermal expansion, different stress tolerances, different everything. Every weld was a first attempt. Calloway worked alongside Tors, cutting bracing struts from the Cathara's own framing and welding them across the failing bulkhead seams. The welds were rough, ugly, industrial. They held. Each one bought minutes, and minutes were survival. A Veshtari structural engineer named Keth appeared at her elbow, barrel-bodied, 4 of his 6 limbs scarred from decades of construction labor. He showed Calloway how to apply Veshtari bonding compound along the seams before welding. The compound bridged the gap between Terran alloy and Veshtari composite. The welds held better. Keth stayed and worked beside her, 4 limbs applying compound while she and Tors welded. At 7:31, the raiders attacked again. 3 ships inbound, hard and fast. The Resolve shuddered under the impact, and Calloway felt it through the docking collar as a deep bass note that rattled tools off the work surface and set the Veshtari children humming louder, their subharmonic rising in pitch. Rourke fought the ship beautifully, using speed and precision to keep the attackers at range while absorbing their fire on his forward shields. He killed a second raider, a clean reactor breach that folded the ship in on itself in a white flash visible through the Cathara's cracked hull plates, but the remaining 2 scored hits on the Resolve, port shield array damaged. A missile penetrated the weakened section and cratered the hull along the crew quarters, wounding 3 sailors and opening a compartment to vacuum that the damage control teams sealed in 90 seconds of controlled fury. And behind them, at the far end of the reach, the other 4 raiders, the ones that had been hunting disabled ships, were converging back on the Cathara cluster. Calloway watched them on the relayed tactical feed, 4 icons closing at cruise speed, unhurried, patient. She keyed comms, DHAL, reinforcement status. Coalition still 11 hours. Drenali 9, Threki no commitment, no change. UENS Ardent 6 hours out at maximum speed. She's the closest Terran ship. 6 hours. Calloway looked at the bulkhead she had just welded. Stress fractures were already forming at its edges, fine lines in the compound where the thermal mismatch was slowly, inevitably, pulling the joint apart. This bulkhead would not last 6 hours. The Resolve, alone against 6 raiders with degraded shields, would not last 6 hours. Nothing here would last 6 hours. She finished the weld, moved to the next one. At 7:58, Voreth found her on deck 4. The Veshtari workers, labor-caste civilians who had been passengers 3 hours ago, had organized themselves into functional teams without being asked. Some carried wounded in relay chains. Some reinforced bulkheads with construction-grade bonding compounds. Some stood in the corridors with forelimbs locked together, forming living walls of hardened chitin between the outer hull and the juvenile compartment. "Commander," he said, "my people wish to know something." "Ask." "Why did you come?" Calloway paused, welding torch still in her hand. The question was simple. The answer should have been simple. But Voreth was looking at her with those compound eyes, and behind him the corridor was full of Veshtari workers watching in silence. And beyond them, through the failing bulkhead, 400 children sat on a cold deck waiting to find out if they would live. "Because you called," she said. Voreth's mandibles moved in a pattern the translator did not render. He turned to his people and spoke in their own frequency, a sound Calloway felt in her ribs rather than heard in her ears. The response was immediate. The workers moved faster. The living walls thickened. The subharmonic hum deepened and steadied, becoming something that resonated through the entire ship, not fear anymore, but determination. At 8:19, all 6 remaining raiders hit the Cathara cluster simultaneously. The Resolve fought like a warship 3 times its rating. Rourke kept the frigate in constant motion, cycling its remaining shields to absorb fire from multiple vectors, railgun and missile batteries firing in a continuous rolling barrage. A third raider died torn apart as Rourke methodically walked his railgun fire across its length, each tungsten round punching through a critical system, until the ship simply came apart. A fourth took severe damage and broke off, trailing debris and atmosphere. But the remaining 4 pressed in, and the Resolve paid the price. Shield generators cycling to failure. Hull breaches along the dorsal section. An electrical fire in the forward weapons bay that the crew fought with extinguishers while the gun crews kept firing around the flames. 15 sailors wounded. The ship's surgeon, working in a medical bay that was treating Veshtari and human casualties side by side, reported that he was running out of burn dressings and had begun cutting up clean uniforms as substitutes. Then a raider got through. A concentrated beam weapon struck the Cathara's upper hull at frame 47, directly above the section where Calloway and Torres had been reinforcing bulkheads. The impact tore through the outer hull, cracked 2 interior bulkheads along their reinforced welds, and opened a breach into the corridor above the juvenile compartment on deck 4. Atmosphere began screaming out through the gap, a white stream of crystallizing nitrogen howling into the vacuum. Calloway grabbed Torres and Okafor and sprinted for the breach. 2 meters wide, ragged edge, the absolute dark of space beyond, atmosphere screaming out in a howling white column. Below, through the deck grating, the juvenile compartment children pressed against the far wall, workers closing their living wall tighter, scarred chitin facing outward, forelimbs interlocked. Torres patch kit, Okafor secondary frame brace, now. Terran patches on Veshtari hull thermal mismatch, bonding incompatibility. Calloway braced the temporary frame against the breach with her own body while Torres welded. The atmosphere thinned. Her respirator kicked in. Cold bit through her suit's thermal layer. Torres welded, the patch sealed. The atmosphere loss slowed, but the edges were already warping. "It won't hold long," Torres said. "Long enough." Secondary brace. They reinforced second layer, third layer. Then Keth appeared with compound and applied it to the seams with 4 hands while Calloway and Torres held the braces. Each layer bought time. Each minute bought was a minute the children kept breathing. At 8:39, between attacks, Calloway took 60 seconds to check on the juvenile compartment below the breach. The patches were holding barely. Water condensation from the atmosphere differential was pooling along the deck grating, dripping down into the compartment below. The Veshtari workers had positioned themselves to catch the droplets before they reached the children, cupping their forelimbs to channel the cold water away from the soft, unhardened chitin of the juveniles. It was a small thing. It was everything. One of the workers, an older female with a deep crack running the length of her left thorax plate, an injury she had clearly been ignoring, looked up at Calloway through the grating. She said nothing. She did not need to. The crack in her chitin was weeping dark green hemolymph, and she had positioned herself directly beneath the coldest section of the dripping grating because that was where the most water would fall, and she was catching it so the children would not have to feel the cold. Calloway marked the worker's position and calmed Ewan. "Medical, I need someone on deck 4 when you have a free hand. Injured Veshtari worker, cracked thorax plate, actively hemorrhaging. She won't leave her post." "I'll send a medic with a field kit." "We've stabilized 8 of the 9 critical cases with the synthesized coagulant. The 9th is touch and go deep thorax fracture. Internal hemorrhaging I can't reach without surgical access. I'm keeping her alive, but she needs a proper hospital. The Ardent has a hospital ship in tow, 4 hours. Then I'll keep her alive for 4 hours." At 8:47, a resolve gunner killed the 4th raider, the damaged one that had tried to rejoin, but the frigate was paying for every kill. Starboard engine at 60%. Shield generators cycling on backup power, each cycle slower than the last. 15 crew wounded, 2 seriously petty officer Chen with shrapnel in his thigh, Ensign Malik with second-degree burns across both forearms from a conduit rupture. She had sealed with her bare hands before the damage control team reached her. Rourke's voice on the tactical channel remained level, but Calloway heard the cost in it. The man was running a naval engagement with a ship that was bleeding capability by the hour. 4 hours until the Ardent, 3 raiders still circling, and the Cathara was dying beneath Calloway's feet. At 8:53, the structural engineer Keth found her on deck 3. He had been running his own damage assessment, 4 limbs moving across the bulkhead surfaces, reading the stress fractures through his chitin the way a human might read temperature through fingertips. His compound eyes were flat, dulled. Calloway had learned enough about Veshtari effect to recognize despair. Commander, frame 31 through 49. The lateral bracing is failing faster than your welds can hold it. I have calculated the cascade timeline. He paused. His mandibles worked without sound. At current degradation rate, the interior compartments on decks 3 and 4 will lose structural containment in approximately 90 minutes. If we sustain another direct hit anywhere on the port side, that timeline collapses to minutes. 90 minutes. The children were on deck 4. Can we reinforce faster? No, the thermal mismatch between your alloy and our composite is progressive. Every weld we place begins failing the moment it cools. We are not repairing the ship, Commander. We are slowing its death, and the death is winning. Calloway stared at the bulkhead. Fine cracks branched through the compound along every weld seam, spreading like frost on glass. Keth was right. She had known it for an hour. She had welded anyway because the alternative was stopping, and stopping meant accepting that the Kethara could not be saved. She accepted it now. At 9:03, Calloway made the decision that defined the rest of the engagement. She was on the Kethara's bridge with Vorath, watching the tactical plot relayed from the Resolve. The 3 remaining raiders had pulled to the edge of weapons range and were holding, conserving energy, regrouping, communicating on encrypted channels. They were not leaving. They were patient in the way that predators are patient when they know the prey cannot run. One more coordinated strike. One more hit to frame 47. One more impact on the juvenile section. The reinforced patches would crack. The bulkheads would buckle, and the atmosphere would scream out through the gaps, and 400 children on deck 4 would have seconds. Captain Rourke, request permission to begin full evacuation of Kethara's population to the Resolve. Elaborate, Commander. Transfer all civilians. Juveniles first, then wounded, then everyone else. Load them into every available space: cargo bays, corridors, shuttle bay, mess hall, briefing rooms, the engine room overflow. Strip the non-essential compartments. The Resolve is damaged but structurally intact. The Kethara is not. One more hit kills this ship and everyone aboard her. We move the people and we let the Kethara go. Commander, we are a frigate with 60 crew and moderate damage. You are proposing over 1,100 additional souls in a vessel not configured for mass habitation. Atmosphere, water, temperature regulation, structural load, the numbers do not work. I am proposing we keep 1,100 people alive for 4 hours, sir. The Ardent is inbound. We survive until she arrives. The Kethara will not survive. The Resolve can. That is the calculation. The numbers don't need to work for a week. They need to work until 1300. 4 seconds of silence, the longest 4 seconds of Calloway's career. Then Rourke's voice, flat and final. Approved. Begin evacuation. You have command of the transfer, Commander. Make it fast. I cannot guarantee the raiders will stay at range. Calloway turned to Vorath. Captain, I need your people to move, all of them. Juveniles first, then wounded, then the rest. Shuttles and docking collar, continuous transfer. Your workers manage the loading. My team coordinates receiving. We do this in under 40 minutes or the raiders do it for us. Vorath's compound eyes held her image in 100 fragments. His injured limbs hung motionless. The rest of his body was utterly still. You are taking our people onto your damaged warship. Yes. All of them. Every single one. Veshtari, Threki, Drenali. Everyone who is alive on this ship transfers to mine. Commander, your ship is already hurt. If you fill it with our people and the raiders attack again, your crew will die alongside ours. You understand this? I understand this. His mandibles clicked in that untranslatable pattern. the one she was beginning to think meant something between grief and trust. He turned and spoke in the subharmonic, a sound that traveled through the Cathara's bones, and 1,100 Veshtari heard it simultaneously. The ship came alive with purpose. On the Resolve, the crew stripped the ship. Every non-essential space cleared in minutes. Bunks folded against walls, personal gear lashed to ceilings, the wardroom converted to medical overflow. Engineering specialist Domings disconnected the recreation console and stacked it in a utility closet to make room for 30 more bodies. The galley crew cleared the mess hall tables and bolted them flat. Nobody complained. Nobody questioned the order to fill their warship with 1,200 strangers from 3 different species, breathing different atmospheres, bleeding different colors, because their commander had said, every single one, and their captain had said, approved. And on the Resolve, those two things together had the weight of natural law. The evacuation was organized chaos at desperate speed. Veshtari workers formed chains through the corridors, passing children hand to hand, 6 hands each, 3 sets, the labor caste efficiency that had built their colonial civilization now repurposed to save it. Shuttle crews ran continuous transfers, 50 passengers per trip, crossing the gap between ships in 2 minutes, docking in 40 seconds, unloading in 90, detaching and turning back. The docking collar became a river of bodies streaming from the dying ship to the living one, while human damage control teams moved the opposite direction, shoring up the Cathara's corridors long enough to empty them. At 9:16, the first juvenile group reached the Resolve's cargo bay. Specialist Akafar, who had 2 daughters at home on Ceres Station, who called them every week without fail, who kept their drawings taped inside his locker door, knelt on the deck and held out his hands to a cluster of young Veshtari frozen at the threshold of the alien ship. Their pale, unhardened chitin caught the white Terran lighting and scattered it in soft amber patterns. Their compound eyes were enormous. One of them the same child, the one from Deck 4, the one who had touched Calloway's glove, reached out a thin forelimb and pressed it against Akafar's open palm. "Warm," the translator said. Akafar smiled. "Yeah, we keep it warm in here, come on." They came, all of them, pouring through the threshold in a stream of soft chitin and clicking forelimbs, guided by Akafar's steady hands, settling onto the deck of a Terran warship as if it were the safest place in the galaxy. In that moment, for those children it was. At 9:24, Ewan calmed from the Resolve's medical section. "Commander, the compound I synthesized from the Cathara's pharmaceutical base mixed with a Terran coagulant analog is stabilizing the critical cases. Hemolymph is clotting properly for the first time in hours. I need more of the Veshtari base compound Deck 2, pharmaceutical locker 7 on the Cathara. As much as you can carry." Calloway changed direction, running against the flow of evacuating civilians, reached Deck 2 and stripped the locker. She carried 4 cases of Veshtari pharmaceutical compound through corridors that were emptying as the evacuation progressed, passed them across the docking collar, and turned back. At 9:31, the 3 remaining raiders attacked. The timing was surgical. Half the Cathara's population was still aboard. The docking collar was active, the shuttles were in transit, and the Resolve was tethered to the dying colony transport, unable to maneuver freely. 2 ships linked by a docking collar in a combat zone, the worst possible geometry. Rourke fought with what he had. He fired over the Cathara's hull, railgun and missile batteries working in alternating salvos to keep the attackers at range. He killed the 5th raider, walked 3 tungsten rounds through its reactor containment, and watched it fold inward, another white flash in a corridor full of them. But the remaining 2 pressed through the defensive fire and split, one striking the Resolve's weakened port shields, the other diving beneath the Cathara's hull to hit the colony transport's engineering section from below. The hit on the Cathara was devastating. The beam weapon struck the primary reactor housing. Secondary explosion. The deck heaved and buckled. Calloway slammed into the corridor wall as artificial gravity stuttered, failed, caught, failed again. Emergency lighting died, replaced by the thin chemical glow of backup strips, faint amber bars along the deck edges, barely enough to see by. The copper ozone smell of the ship spiked with something new. Reactor coolant, acrid and sharp, mixing with the air. Reactor containment failure on the Cathara, D-Hal reported from the Resolve. Primary containment breached. Secondary containment holding but degrading. She's losing power across all systems. Estimate 12 minutes to total failure. Commander, you need to get everyone off that ship. 12 minutes. 306 Veshtari still aboard. 109 of them juveniles who had not yet reached the transfer corridor, the youngest groups, the ones being carried because they could not walk fast enough. Calloway ran. Through corridors with failing gravity and dying lights, through clusters of adult Veshtari being herded toward the docking collar by their workers, past the structural engineer Keth who was still applying bonding, compound to failing seams, buying seconds with each application. She grabbed his upper forelimb as she passed. Keth, stop, everyone moves to the collar now. He looked at the seam he was bonding, then at her. Then he dropped his tools and followed, and as he moved he called out in the subharmonic, a sharp pulse that cut through the ambient vibration, and every Veshtari worker on Deck 3 turned and began moving toward the transfer corridor. Calloway reached the lower sections at 9:34. The remaining juveniles were in two groups, separated by a buckled bulkhead on Deck 4 that had partially collapsed after the reactor hit. 62 on one side, 47 on the other. The 62 were being carried by a ring of workers, moving toward the main corridor. The 47 were trapped. She keyed comms. Tors, Deck 4, Frame 38. Collapsed bulkhead between sections C and D, 47 juveniles on the far side. I need cutting equipment now. On my way, 2 minutes. Tors arrived in 90 seconds. He brought the heavy cutter and Akafar, who had left the cargo bay at a dead sprint when he heard the call. Together they cut through the collapsed bulkhead while the atmosphere thinned around them, and the deck shuddered with the rhythm of a reactor dying. Tors cut. Akafar pulled debris. Calloway braced the edges of the opening with her body, holding the cut section apart while Veshtari workers on the far side passed children through the gap. One by one, small soft bodies handed carefully through jagged metal by beings whose construction-scarred forelimbs were gentler than anything their appearance suggested. 47, she counted everyone. This way. Follow me. She led them through the maintenance corridor she had memorized from the deck plans during the 4-hour transit, a shortcut through the utility passages, the secondary route she had studied because some part of her had known, before she had any evidence, that she would need to know the fastest way out. It cut 2 minutes off the route to the docking collar. The workers followed without hesitation, forelimbs clutching children, compound eyes locked on the human running ahead in the flickering dark. At 9:39, a second hit struck the Cathara, not from a raider from the ship itself. A secondary containment failure in the reactor sent a pressure wave through the engineering section that blew out a coolant line on Deck 3. The ship groaned, a deep structural sound that Calloway felt through her boots. Emergency bulkheads began slamming shut throughout the lower decks, the ship's automated systems trying to isolate the failing sections. One of those bulkheads closed across the transfer corridor, 30 meters ahead of Calloway and the juvenile group. Tors, Corridor B7, emergency bulkhead sealed across the transfer route. Tors was already there. He hit the manual override. Nothing. The system was locked, the ship's dying computer prioritizing structural containment over crew access, because the Cathara's systems did not know there were people still aboard who needed that corridor open. Override's dead, Tors said. The control system is failing. I can cut through, but it'll take 4 minutes. They did not have 4 minutes. The secondary containment was failing. The reactor was going critical. "Cut," Calloway said. She turned to the workers carrying the children. "Back. Maintenance Corridor 7, Junction D, we go around." She led them back the way they had come, through a maintenance passage barely wide enough for the Veshtari workers, around the sealed bulkhead, through a utility junction she had memorized from the deck plans, a path she had noted as a secondary evacuation route during her initial study, a route that existed on the plans as a dotted line labeled maintenance access only. It added 90 seconds. 90 seconds they could not afford. But it was open, and open was alive. They reached the docking collar at 9:43. The collar was damaged, the second reactor failure had shifted the alignment between the two ships, and the seal was leaking atmosphere in thin white streams. Torres was there, having sprinted from the cut point when he heard Calloway's reroute. He had the collar on manual override, holding the seal through force of will and the kind of profanity that transcended language. Calloway pushed the juvenile group through, counted heads, 47 from the trapped group, 62 from the first group already through. The remaining adults streaming past. She stood at the collar's threshold and counted, one hand braced against the frame, her body a checkpoint that no one passed without being tallied. At 9:46, a third hit the resolve this time. The raider that had been pressing Rourke's weakened shield scored a direct hit on the frigate's dorsal hull. The impact traveled through the docking collar as a deep bass shock that threw Calloway sideways. She heard the crack before she felt it left radius, clean fracture, the pain arriving 1 full second after the sound, total and white-hot and absolute. She caught herself on the frame with her right hand. Her left arm hung wrong. She looked at it for 1 second, felt the nausea rise, forced it down, and kept counting. Workers, parents, wounded carried on improvised stretchers made from stripped deck paneling. Drenali merchant crew, Thos at the rear, stubborn to the last. The remaining Threki sailors. Keth through now. The structural engineer paused at the threshold. He looked back at the ship he had spent his career building things inside of. His compound eyes were flat with grief. Then he stepped through. At 9:49, Calloway calmed the resolve. D. How many souls still registering on the Kethara? A pause, 2 life signs, Commander, you and Captain Vorath. Location on Vorath. Bridge. She ran, broken arm pressed against her chest, through the Kethara's dying corridors, gravity gone now, magnetic boots the only thing keeping her on the deck, the chemical glow strips failing one by one as the ship's last power reserves drained toward the reactor. She reached the bridge and found Vorath standing at his command console, 4 functional limbs moving across the controls. He was transmitting not a distress call, not a message. He was dumping the Kethara's passenger manifest, medical records, cargo logs, and navigational data to the Resolve's computer. Every record of his ship and his people, transferred in the final minutes so that nothing would be lost. Captain through the collar now. 20 seconds, Commander. The transfer is completing. Vorath, the reactor. I know what the reactor is doing. I have been a captain for 40 years. I know the sound. His mandibles clicked. 18 seconds. She waited. The deck vibrated beneath her boots with a frequency that meant the secondary containment had failed, and the primary reaction mass was destabilizing. She could feel it in her teeth. Transfer complete, Vorath said. He stepped back from the console. Looked at his bridge, the amber-lit command center of a colony transport that had carried 1,114 souls across the Yoth reach and would never carry anyone again. His compound eyes held the room in 100 fractured images. My ship, he said quietly. Your people are alive, Calloway said. They're on my ship. They need their captain. Move. He moved. Through the corridors, injured limbs dragging, old chitin scraping the walls. Calloway followed, her broken arm a continuous white screaming she had stopped processing as pain and started processing as noise, background noise, like engine hum, something that existed but did not matter because stopping was not an option. They reached the collar. Torres was still there, hands white-knuckled on the manual override, holding the seal through sheer refusal to let it fail. "Through," Calloway said. Voreth stepped through the collar, his injured limbs catching on the seal, his old body struggling with the gap. Torres held it. Calloway held it. Together they held the collar open while the last captain of the Cathara crossed from his dying ship to the living one. Calloway followed. Torres hit the emergency release. The collar separated with a grinding shriek. Through the closing hatch, Calloway watched the Cathara's corridor lights die, section by section, amber fading to black in a sequence that traveled from the bow toward the stern like a long, slow exhalation. The ship letting go. 78 seconds later, the reactor breached. The explosion was silent in vacuum, a bloom of white light that lit the wreckage field of the Yoth Reach like a momentary star, casting sharp shadows across the Resolve's hull. Debris expanded outward in a sphere, fragments of Veshtari composite glinting as they tumbled. The Cathara was gone. Its people were not. The Resolve was designed for 60. It now held 60 crew and 1,200 additional souls, 1,114 Veshtari civilians including 406 juveniles, 43 Threki sailors from the Sheth Varak, 43 Drenali merchant crew from Thas's freighter. Every corridor was packed, every cargo bay full. The shuttle bay held 300 juveniles and the workers who had positioned themselves as a living wall between the children and the bay doors and refused, absolutely, to be moved. The medical section treated casualties from 4 species, Veshtari, Threki, Drenali, and humans side by side. The mess hall was a dormitory. The briefing room was a nursery. The engine room overflow held 40 Drenali, and a cluster of Veshtari laborers who had taken one look at the Resolve's battered reactor housing and begun, without being asked, running diagnostic checks with their own engineering tools. Calloway stood on the operations deck with her arm in a field splint that Ewan had applied in 45 seconds flat, while telling her she was an idiot for not reporting the fracture sooner. The splint hurt, everything hurt. She watched the plot. 2 raiders remained. The Resolve was damaged, slow, running hot, and carrying over 1,200 lives it could not afford to lose. The Ardent was 3 hours and 20 minutes away. "Captain, recommend we go dark. Minimum emissions. Drift into the Cathara's debris field and let the wreckage scatter our signature. We can't outrun them and we can't outfight them, but we can disappear." Rourke studied the plot. His face was drawn, exhaustion pulling at the lines around his eyes, but his voice was steady. "Do it. Minimum power. Essential systems only. If they can't find us, they can't kill us." Silent running all decks. The Resolve powered down to essential systems and drifted into the expanding cloud of the Cathara's wreckage, letting the debris field envelop it. Not invisible, a frigate is too large to truly disappear, but obscured. One more piece of metallic debris in a field of thousands, its thermal signature masked by the still cooling remnants of the colony transport's reactor, its sensor profile lost in the scatter of Veshtari composite fragments tumbling through the void. The word went out through the ship. Silence. On every deck, in every corridor, 1,200 beings and 60 crew went quiet. The Veshtari suppressed even their subharmonic, the deep vibration that had filled the ship since they came aboard fading to nothing. The Threki sailors' breath shallow. The Drenali closed their eyes. The human crew powered down every non-essential system, every console light, every indicator. The Resolve became a dark ship, drifting in a dead ship's grave, carrying the living among the wreckage of the lost. The raiders searched. Calloway watched them on passive sensors, 2 icons prowling the debris field perimeter. They knew the Resolve was in there. They knew the frigate was damaged, overloaded, vulnerable. But the debris field was vast, the thermal scatter was dense, and every piece of wreckage looked like every other piece on their sensors. They swept. They scanned. They fired speculative shots into the field beam weapons lancing through the debris, vaporizing fragments of the Cathara's hull in brief flashes that cast strobing shadows through the Resolve's viewports. At 10:15, one of those shots passed 200 meters above the Resolve's dorsal hull, close enough that the radiation sensors flickered, close enough that Calloway's breath stopped in her chest, not close enough to hit, not this time. In the shuttle bay, Okafor felt the radiation warning pulse through his suit's sensor. He did not react. He did not flinch. He kept his hand on the sleeping child's back, kept humming, kept the 60 juveniles around him calm through the simple mechanism of being calm himself. One of the Veshtari workers, the old female with the cracked thorax plate, the one who had been catching cold water drips on the Cathara to keep the children dry, was sitting across from him. Ewan's medic had treated her fracture with the synthesized coagulant, and the hemorrhaging had stopped, but she was weak. She watched Okafor with her compound eyes, and though Calloway was not there to see it, the worker reached across the gap between species and placed one scarred forelimb on Okafor's knee. He placed his hand on top of it. Neither of them moved from that spot for the next hour. At 10:23, the Drenali Captain Thos appeared on the operations deck. He had not been summoned. He carried a datapad, one of the Cathara's maintenance tablets, salvaged during the evacuation, and his reedy voice was stripped of everything except competence. "Commander Calloway, my engineer Das has been running diagnostics on your reactor housing since we boarded. Your port cooling manifold has a hairline fracture at Junction 9 that your damage control teams have not detected because it is not yet leaking. At current reactor output, it will begin leaking in approximately 2 hours. At the output you will need if you run from this debris field, it will begin leaking in 40 minutes and reach critical failure in 60. Your ship does not know it is dying, Commander, but it is." Calloway stared at him. "How did your engineer find a fracture our own diagnostics missed?" "Drenali ships run hotter than Terran ships. We know what thermal stress fractures look like before they open. It is the one advantage of building cheap." He set the datapad on the console. "Junction 9. If your chief Tors can reinforce it before you need to run, you will have full reactor output when the time comes. If he cannot, your port engine will fail under load and you will not outrun anything." Calloway looked at the diagnostic data. It was precise. It was correct. A fracture her own systems had classified as within tolerance was, in fact, 60 minutes from catastrophic failure under combat load. "Tors," she calmed. "Drop what you're doing. Reactor housing, port cooling manifold, Junction 9. Hairline fracture. Reinforce it, priority 1. "Copy, Commander. What tipped you off?" "A Drenali merchant captain who builds cheap ships and knows what breaking looks like." Tors was there in 4 minutes. Thas's engineer Das, a wiry Drenali female with oil-stained hands, and the focused silence of someone who solved problems instead of discussing them, met him at the junction and showed him the fracture. Together they reinforced it. Terran welding rig, Drenali thermal stress analysis, the kind of cross-species engineering collaboration that no manual had ever anticipated and no academy had ever taught. The weld held. The junction held. The Resolve gained back the margin it did not know it had lost. Calloway did not thank Thas. She did not need to. He nodded once, took his datapad, and went back to the water reclamation system, which he had improved by another 4 hours of capacity using parts stripped from the Cathara's recycler before the evacuation. Stubborn, practical, and quietly saving lives in ways that would never appear in any report. At 10:42, the raiders settled into a patrol pattern at the exits of the debris field. A siege within a siege. Predators at the mouth of a den, patient, waiting for the prey to break cover. Calloway studied the pattern for 30 minutes, logging the timing, the arc, the gaps. One gap, 6 minutes, every 43 minutes when both raiders were on the far side of their patrol arc. She logged it. She did not use it. Not yet. At 10:55, Voss Wren came to the operations deck. The Threki lieutenant was efficient in the way that military officers of any species are efficient. She assessed the situation, identified what she could contribute, and offered it without preamble. "Commander, my sailors are combat trained and rested relative to your crew. Your people have been fighting for 11 hours. Mine have been doing damage control for 6. If it comes to a fight, I can crew your aft weapons stations. Threki fire control doctrine is compatible with your targeting systems. We use similar predictive algorithms. Your gunners get a rotation break. Mine get weapons." Calloway looked at her. A Threki naval officer, from a government that had been arguing about jurisdictional authority while its own cutter was being destroyed, offering to crew a Terran warship's guns to defend a Veshtari colony transports passengers. "Do it, take aft station 2, coordinate with Petty Officer Hale." Vossren nodded and left. Within 10 minutes, 8 Threki sailors were at the aft weapons consoles, sharp-featured faces lit by the dim standby glow of the targeting screens, catch-reflective eyes reading the firing solutions. Hale, the Resolve's aft gunnery officer, gave them a 60-second briefing on the system differences, and then stepped aside to eat his first meal in 14 hours. At 11:08, the atmosphere system began to fail. 1,200 beings breathing air designed for 60. The scrubbers were at 300% capacity and climbing, CO2 levels rising, temperature increasing. The nitrogen-heavy mix the Veshtari needed was diluting the oxygen the humans required. Calloway ordered waste heat vented through the ventral radiators, a calculated risk, since the thermal bloom might be detectable, but hyperthermia in a ship packed with soft-shelled children was the more immediate threat. Vossren organized her Threki sailors into a manual ventilation relay, opening and closing hatches in sequence to circulate air through the ship without running the fans. It was a submarine technique, centuries old, adapted for a warship that had become a submarine in all but name. The temperature stabilized. The children stopped panting. The Threki worked in shifts, rotating every 20 minutes, fur matted with sweat. At 11:34, Ewan reported from medical. "Commander, the 9th critical case has stabilized. The synthesized coagulant finally slowed the internal hemorrhaging enough for her own clotting to engage. She's going to make it." "Good work, Chief. I've treated 53 casualties across 4 species today. 49 Veshtari, 12 Threki, 8 human, 4 Drenali. Commander, I should inform you that Specialist Akafer has taught approximately 40 Veshtari children how to play a clapping game. I am noting this for the record because it is the single most effective psychological intervention I have observed in a combat zone, and I intend to recommend it be added to the field manual." Calloway almost smiled, almost. She moved through the ship because standing still would mean thinking, and thinking would mean calculating all the ways this could still end in the next 2 hours. She walked every corridor, checked every compartment, not because she could fix anything by walking, but because 1,200 people needed to see her walking, needed to see the human with the broken arm and the steady face moving through their midst as if she believed, without reservation, that they would survive this. She was not certain she believed it. She walked anyway. She found Tors in a crawlspace beneath the ventral hull, welding patches by helmet light. He had been welding for 12 hours straight Kethara, then Resolve, his hands blistered inside his gloves, his knees raw from the grating. "When did you last eat?" He paused, thought about it. "Yesterday, I think." "Eat something, that's an order." "After this weld, Commander." She found Akafer in the shuttle bay, cross-legged on the deck, surrounded by 60 Veshtari juveniles in a loose semicircle. He was teaching them the clapping game, hands out, palms flat, waiting for them to match the rhythm. The children did not have palms, but they tapped their forelimbs together in an approximation that produced a softer, clicking sound. Akafer grinned every time they got close. He was humming while he played. A low, tuneless sound, nothing musical, just vibration. The children leaned toward it, compound eyes half closed, small bodies pressed together for warmth, drawn to the sound the way they would have been drawn to a Veshtari adult subharmonic. One had fallen asleep against his side, its soft chitin pressed against his ribs. Akefer had draped his jacket over it and did not move from that spot. Calloway watched for 10 seconds. Then she moved on, because the sight of 60 alien children clapping with a human specialist in a warship's shuttle bay would break something she needed intact for 2 more hours. She found Voreth in cargo bay 2. He stood among his people, six-limbed and upright despite his injuries, despite his exhaustion, despite the fact that his ship was a debris field and his people were refugees aboard a stranger's vessel. Around him, the Veshtari were singing not through mandibles but through their bodies, a subharmonic resonance that vibrated through the deck plating, through the bulkheads, through Calloway's boots and up through her bones. It was low and vast and steady, and it was the most beautiful thing she had ever felt. "The song is a counting," Voreth said. "We are counting our living." "How many?" "All of them, 1114. Every soul who boarded the Cathara is aboard your ship." Calloway leaned against the bulkhead. Her arm hurt, her legs trembled. Her eyes burned with exhaustion and something she would not name. And 1114 Veshtari civilians were alive aboard her ship, counted and singing. At 12:47, Dehal's voice cut across the operations deck. "Commander, the raiders are moving, both of them converging on the debris field perimeter. They've tightened the patrol pattern. The 6-minute gap has closed to 90 seconds. I think they've narrowed our position." Calloway was at the plot in 4 strides. The 2 raider icons had shifted inward, reducing their patrol arc, concentrating their search. They were triangulating, getting smarter or getting desperate. It did not matter which, because the result was the same. Time to the Ardent. 51 minutes. 51 minutes. If the raiders found them, the Resolve would have to fight damaged, overloaded, with 1,200 civilians in every compartment. A running fight in a debris field with juveniles in the shuttle bay. Calloway did not calculate the odds. She had stopped calculating odds hours ago. She calculated options instead. "Captain Rourke, if they find us, I recommend we run, not fight. The gap in their patrol arc is down to 90 seconds, but it still exists. If we time it right, we can clear the debris field and make for the Ardent at best speed. They'll pursue, but the Ardent is close enough now that we only need to stay ahead of them for 40 minutes. Rourke studied the plot. The starboard engine is at 55%. Best speed is not what it was. It doesn't have to be faster than them. It has to be fast enough to keep the range open until the Ardent closes it from the other side. And if they catch us before the Ardent arrives, then we fight. But we fight while running, not while sitting in a debris field with nowhere to go." Rourke nodded. "Prep the engines for cold start. When the gap opens, we go." At 12:59, the gap opened. Calloway watched the 2 raider icons reach the far edge of their patrol arc, their courses diverging for 90 seconds before they would swing back. "Now," she said. The Resolve's engines fired cold, a shuddering, uneven ignition that shook the hull and sent a thermal bloom across every sensor in the debris field. Subtlety was over. Speed was all that mattered. The frigate surged forward, clearing the debris field in 18 seconds, emerging into open space at maximum acceleration. Behind them, the 2 raiders detected the thermal flare and turned to pursue. Rourke ran the ship hard. Every remaining system pushed to its limit. The starboard engine screamed at 55%, the port engine compensating, the reactor feeding everything it had into propulsion. Behind them, the raiders closed. Faster ships, undamaged, unburdened by 1,200 passengers and the structural damage of a 10-hour battle. "Range?" Calloway asked. 12,000 meters and closing. They'll be in weapons range in 4 minutes. Time to the Ardent. 38 minutes. The math did not work. The raiders would reach weapons range long before the Ardent could intervene. Calloway looked at Rourke. Rourke looked at the plot. "Weapons free," the captain said. "Aft batteries keep them honest." The Resolve's aft railgun opened fire not to kill, but to force the raiders to evade, to buy seconds with every shot. The Threcki gunners at aft station 2 worked the targeting system with a fluency that surprised Hale when he returned from his meal. Vossren's fire control doctrine was different in the details but identical in the fundamentals, and her sailors were placing suppressive fire with the precision of a crew that had been drilling on this system for years, not minutes. The tungsten rounds screamed into the void behind them. The raiders jinked, dodged, lost ground, regained it. The range closed 10,000 meters, 9, 8. At 1304, a Threcki gunner named Vosket scored a hit on the lead raider's forward sensor array, a shot that Hale later described as the best piece of aft gunnery I have seen in 12 years of service, and it was fired by someone who learned the system 20 minutes ago. The raider lost its primary targeting capability. It did not stop pursuing, but it began firing blind, its beam weapons sweeping in wide arcs that missed the Resolve by hundreds of meters. The second raider compensated, tightening its pursuit, closing the range for both of them. At 1308, the second raider fired. The beam weapon struck the Resolve's stern, cratering the hull plating above the starboard engine. The ship shuddered. Damage reports flooded the operations deck. Hull breach, compartment 14, directly adjacent to the mess hall where 43 Drenali crew had been sleeping, sealed in 12 seconds by the damage control team and 3 Veshtari workers who had materialized from the adjacent corridor without being called, their construction-scarred forelimbs holding the emergency seal in place while the Terran crew welded. No casualties, this time. "Starboard engine down to 40%, the engineering officer reported. "We're losing speed." "The port manifold is holding," Torres added from the reactor housing. "Thas's fix is solid, port engine at full power. We can compensate but not enough." The raiders closed faster now, 7,000 meters, 6, 5. At this range their beam weapons could cut through the Resolve's weakened hull with sustained fire. In the shuttle bay, 300 juveniles and their worker guardians felt the ship shudder and heard the distant impact of weapons fire. The subharmonic rose, not fear, not panic, but the steady, controlled vibration of a community holding itself together through collective will. Akafar sat among them, humming, his jacket still draped over the sleeping child, his hand still resting on the old worker's forelimb. He did not know the tactical situation. He did not need to. His job was here. On the operations deck, Calloway watched the plot and felt the weight of 1,200 lives in every number on the screen. The range numbers were arithmetic. The lives were not. Each meter of closing distance was a probability of failure that she could calculate but could not accept. She had carried these people through a 4-hour transit, a 10-hour battle, a desperate evacuation, and 3 hours of hiding in the wreckage of their own ship. She had not brought them this far to lose them in the last 30 minutes. "D. Hal, any signal from the Ardent?" "Nothing, Commander, she should be." Then an incoming transmission, not from behind them, from ahead. A Terran military identification code, broadcasting on all frequencies, drowning out everything else in the sector. "UENS Ardent to all vessels in the Yoth Reach. This is Commander Shin. Hostile vessels, you will stand down and power off your weapon systems. You have 30 seconds to comply. There will not be a second warning." The Ardent dropped out of superluminal transit directly between the Resolve and the pursuing raiders, 340 meters of heavy cruiser, fresh, undamaged, weapons hot, shields at full power. She was not alone. A hospital ship, the UENS Vigil, dropped in on her port quarter. A supply tender, the UENS Stockton, on her starboard. 3 ships where one had been expected. The lead raider's weapons powered down before Shin finished speaking. Both raiders turned and ran, scattering at maximum speed in opposite directions. Commander Shin did not pursue. She let them go. The Yoth reach was clear. At 1312, the Ardent moved alongside the Resolve. Commander Shin hailed them. "Report status, Resolve." Rourke's voice was thin with exhaustion. "Moderate to heavy damage. Operational. Carrying 1,200 non-crew personnel, Veshtari civilian, Threki military, Drenali merchant. Wounded aboard from all parties. We've been fighting for 10 hours. Request medical support, engineering assistance, and passenger transfer." A long silence. Then, "Did you say 1,200 on a frigate?" "On the Resolve, yes." Another silence. "Hold position, Resolve, we're coming alongside, Shin out." The Vigil moved in within the hour. Medical teams boarded the Resolve, and Calloway watched them stop in the corridor, every one of them, when they saw what was inside. 1,200 beings from 4 species packed into a ship designed for 60, organized into every compartment, every bay, every corridor. Veshtari children in the shuttle bay with a human specialist who had not moved in 3 hours because one of them was asleep against his side. Threki sailors running manual ventilation, relays with the discipline of a crew that had found purpose in someone else's fight. Drenali engineers in the reactor housing, quietly running diagnostics they had not been asked to run. Veshtari laborers who had stripped deck paneling from the Cathara to build stretchers and braced a Terran warship's bulkheads with their own bodies. And 60 Terran crew, exhausted beyond calculation, still at their stations because no one had told them to stop. A Vigil medical officer, a tall woman with commander's insignia, and the professional composure of a career surgeon, stepped through the boarding tube, took 3 steps into the Resolve's corridor and stopped. She looked left, where a Veshtari worker with a cracked thorax plate was sitting against the wall with 2 juveniles asleep in her lap. She looked right, where Torres was welding a patch by the light of a hand torch, 12 hours into a shift he had never clocked out of. She looked down, where a Drenali merchant sailor was sleeping on the bare deck with a Terran thermal blanket pulled over his shoulders, a blanket that had not existed on this ship 12 hours ago, acquired from somewhere by someone during the evacuation, given to a stranger. "How long?" the surgeon asked quietly. 10 hours, Calloway said. The surgeon looked at her broken arm in a field splint, uniform streaked with Veshtari hemolymph and Terran hydraulic fluid and reactor coolant, eyes that had not closed in 20 hours. She said nothing more. She went to work. The wounded were transferred first. Ewan supervised 18 hours without rest, hands steady, voice level, walking each critical case to the boarding tube herself. She had not slept. She had not eaten since a ration bar at 600, consumed standing up between patients. She had treated injuries across 4 species using protocols she had invented on the spot, with compounds she had synthesized from alien pharmaceuticals, in a medical bay that was designed for a crew of 60 and had processed over 70 casualties. She walked every critical case to the tube because that was what she did. She did not stop until the last one was across. The 9th critical case, the Veshtari female with the deep thorax fracture, the one Ewan had kept alive for 4 hours through sheer medical stubbornness, was carried across on a stretcher by 2 human medics and a Veshtari worker who had held her forelimb since the evacuation and would not let go. The medics did not ask the worker to release her grip. They carried the stretcher around it. The juveniles were moved to the Vigil's passenger wards, where someone Calloway never learned who had already adjusted the lighting to amber and raised the temperature. Someone on the Vigil had read the Veshtari physiology file that D. Hal had transmitted during the transit and understood that the children needed warmth. It was a small thing. It told Calloway everything she needed to know about the kind of ship the Vigil was. The Stockton transferred food, water, medical supplies, and something nobody had requested. Hundreds of thermal blankets passed across the boarding tubes without orders, without paperwork, without being asked. Blankets for beings whose biology the Stockton's crew had never encountered, carried across by sailors who had never met a Veshtari, offered without ceremony to children whose species they could not name. Someone had looked at the manifest and thought, they might be cold. Voreth came to find Calloway one last time as his people were being transferred. He stood in the doorway of the operations deck, an insectoid captain on a human warship, his old chitin dull with exhaustion, 2 of his 6 limbs still hanging motionless from shrapnel wounds, compound eyes holding her reflection in 100 fractured images. Commander Calloway. Captain, I have been a ship captain for 40 years, he said. I have served 3 trade houses and 2 colonial administrations. I have called for help before. Each time the answer was a calculation whether the cost of rescue exceeded the value of the rescued. The Drenali calculated and found us too expensive. The Coalition calculated and found us too distant. The Threki calculated and found us jurisdictionally inconvenient. This is how the galaxy operates. Efficient. Practical. Each species weighing the cost against the benefit and concluding, correctly by their own arithmetic, that we were not worth the expenditure. His mandibles worked in that untranslatable pattern. His voice, through the translator, carried harmonics the device could not fully render. You did not calculate. You heard our call and came, 1 ship against 8, 4 hours at full speed to reach us. You came and bled and fought, and when our ship died you took our children onto your decks and your hull became our shield. Your people welded our bulkheads and carried our wounded and taught our children games while your own ship burned around you. I have tried to find a framework for what you gave today, Commander. There is no column in any ledger that accounts for it. No trade house balance sheet. No colonial administration metric. There is no word in my language for what your species did in the Yoth Reach. We have a word for rescue. We have a word for alliance. We have a word for debt. None of them is sufficient. Calloway's arm throbbed. Her eyes burned. The splint dug into her skin. She was so tired the deck seemed to tilt under her feet. There was no ledger, Captain. There was a call, we answered it. That is the whole of it. Voreth bowed. All 6 limbs, even the injured ones, even the 2 that hung motionless and must have screamed with the effort, folded inward, his thorax bending nearly to the deck. Behind him, in the corridor, the Veshtari workers bowed in silence, one after another, a corridor of insectoid beings folding themselves in gratitude toward a species they had never met before today and would never forget. Then he rose. He walked to the boarding tube, slow and dignified and broken. His people followed, and the resolve was quiet. It was the kind of quiet that comes after something enormous, not empty, but full. The way a room is full after the last note of music fades. 1,200 beings had been aboard this ship, and the echo of them remained in the scuffed deck plating, the adjusted temperature controls, the amber light someone had set in the shuttle bay and forgotten to change back. The subharmonic hum that had vibrated through the hull for hours was gone, and its absence was a sound of its own, a silence shaped like 1,100 voices that had been counting their living and had finished the count. Calloway stood on the operations deck for a long time after the last transfer. Tors found her there and reported that his hands had finally stopped working, the blisters had opened inside his gloves, and the nerve damage from 12 hours of continuous welding had caught up. Ewan treated him. He did not complain. He asked when the next duty rotation started. Akafor reported last. He had stayed in the shuttle bay until every juvenile was transferred, walking each group to the boarding tube, waiting until the last child had crossed. The sleeping one, the one who had been draped in his jacket, woke when they moved it and made a sound the translator rendered as a single word. Stay. Akafor knelt and pressed his forehead against the child's soft chitin, a gesture that had no cross-species precedent and needed none. Then he stood and watched it carried across to the vigil. He retrieved his jacket. It smelled like copper and ozone, and something else, the pheromonal signature of trust, the chemical trace of a child that had decided a stranger was safe. He wore the jacket for the rest of the deployment. He never washed it. Vosren came to the operations deck before her own transfer, her Trekkie sailors assembled behind her. She saluted Calloway a Trekkie military salute, right paw to the left shoulder, sharp and precise. "Commander, my government argued jurisdiction while my ship died. You did not argue, you came." She paused. Her cat-reflective eyes were bright. "My crew will remember. The Trekkie Navy will remember. There are some debts that transcend politics." She turned and led her sailors to the boarding tube. They went in formation, disciplined to the last, 43 Trekkie walking off a Terran frigate that they had helped defend with borrowed guns and improvised ventilation. They had arrived as refugees. They left as crew. Captain Rourke's after-action report was 23 pages. Paragraph 12 read: Commander Calloway led the evacuation of 1,114 Veshtari civilians, 43 Trekkie military personnel, and 43 Drenali merchant crew from the colony transport Kethara under active fire, sustaining a fractured left radius through a failing docking collar in the final 12 minutes before reactor breach. No civilian was left behind. No soul of any species was abandoned. The report listed the damage, the casualties, the ammunition expenditure, the hours fought, the raiders killed, the hull breaches sealed. It did not mention the singing. It did not mention the child who said warm. It did not mention the blankets, or Ewan's improvised coagulant, or the workers who built walls from their own bodies, or the structural engineer who kept bonding seams on a dying ship, because every second of structural integrity was a second his people were breathing. Some things do not fit in reports. 6 months later, a small package arrived at the Resolve's home port, addressed to Commander M. Calloway, UENS Resolve. It contained a piece of old, amber chitin, polished smooth, heavy in the hand, with fine lines carved into its surface by a mandible that had worked with the precision of a jeweler. The carving was in Veshtari script. Translated, the lines read: "You were the answer." No return address, no note, no sender's name. Just the chitin, the words, and the weight of 1,114 lives carried home on a ship too small for the job, by people who came anyway. Calloway put it on her desk. She never moved it. Every morning it was the first thing she saw, and every morning it reminded her of the only thing that mattered, the only thing that had ever mattered, across all the cold calculations of a galaxy that measured the worth of a rescue against its cost. Someone called, she answered. That was the whole record.